This week's workshop focuses on what I'm referring to as Education 2.0, or the role of digital technology and media in educational settings and also in the lives of young people who we will teach. Next semester, you all do a course with me called Connected Classrooms, and the MTP secondary students do an integrated e-pedagogy subject as well. So there are a number of topics related to digital technologies that will be covered in much greater detail in that course. So today I wanted to focus quite specifically on a bigger picture view of the role that that technology and social media in particular play in the lives of the young people that we will all be teaching, and also the implications for schools and places where education take place of advances in technology. There are three key ideas I wanted to focus on today. The first of those links back to our lecture last week where we looked at Bourdieu's theory of social capital and habitus, and to position ICT potentially as a form of cultural capital. I wanted also to build on your understanding of young people's use of media and technology and the possible implications that might have on your role as a teacher, and to look at the potential impacts, as I said, of digital technologies on where education takes place and the ramifications that might have for schools as we currently know them. Young people bring a virtual backpack of stuff with them from beyond the school gate. Last week we talked about different forms of capital, that economic, social and especially cultural capital that is acquired from our experiences, particularly as young people from our parents and the experiences they create for us. We talked about how someone's various forms of capital form resources, and that these collectively form our habitus, our ability to understand the rules of the game and to fit in, and how our habitus can help or hinder a young person's ability to navigate their way through schooling successfully. One of the biggest trends over the last 20 years has been the increasing extent to which young people also bring media and technology with them in their virtual backpacks. However, not all young people have had equal access to media and digital technologies. Over that period, there has been unequal access to media and digital technologies between people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, what's referred to as the digital divide. We can see that this may still be the case from studies into digital technology access, and I'm going to be showing you in a few slides some of the data from those studies. One of my big problems, though, is that the data is now over 5 years old, and in the world of technology, that is a really, really long time. However, what the studies show is that household income, our economic capital, has an influence on the technology use by young people. In a 2009 study by the ACMA, Australian Communications and Media Authority, into the internet habits of young people, those young people in households where income was over $100,000 per annum used the internet significantly more often and for longer periods compared to young people from lower income households. So the argument goes that the more you use the technology and the longer that you use the technology, the better you are at using the technology. So it was believed that increased access to internet technology enabled those young people who had greater access to advance their skills. Where schools are starting to use technology more frequently and in a more dominant way, then those young people who have had less access to technology were seen to be at a disadvantage. So that was the argument, and ICT was positioned as a form of cultural capital, your ability to navigate your way through the technology was seen as an advantage to your learning. However, more recent data suggests, this in smaller scale studies, suggests that by the time children reach their mid-teens, their internet usage is approximately the same as their parents. This actually shows that family, especially parents, have an influence on the cultural capital, i.e. the technology use of their children. If you came from a family where there was much lower internet use, the children's internet use was lower. But more recent studies have thrown some doubt on this, although I have to say those studies were from fairly homogeneous economies where low income was probably a relative thing rather than an absolute low income. And what those studies were suggesting was that with the increased ubiquitous distribution of technology, that the difference between those who had slightly more access and those who had less access was not significant. So I still wonder, though, if there is a digital divide, whether there are still pockets of our population of young people who don't have as much access as others, and how that might play out in your classroom. I was searching Google for images of young people and technology, and this is what I found. Think for a minute about what you're seeing in these images. These young people to me all seem fairly white and middle class and fairly affluent. There's not a particular racial mix in them, nor does it appear that there's a particular socioeconomic mix in them, although that's hard to judge from images. Just something to think about how we portray technology users, or how the technology users are portrayed. I guess the point behind those images and this one as well is that young people's use of digital technologies is exceptionally high. In this social networking infographic, it tells us that 96% of students with internet access report using social network technologies. So technologies are used intensively, and older people would probably suggest excessively by young people. But what the data is suggesting is that their main use is as social networking. Let's have a look at some of the data. So what this data is telling us is that as children get older, their internet usage increases quite substantially. Not just their frequency of use, like how many days they might be on the internet, but the number of hours that they're on the internet. This slide's perhaps a little bit more difficult to read in any great detail, but what it shows you is that as children get older, they have more reasons to use the internet and digital technologies, and the reasons shift from individual pursuits, such as researching information for homework or playing games, to more social pursuits, connecting with friends and using the internet to upload and download, so music, photos, videos, and importantly, and increasingly, to create their own media. Homework stays about static in this data, but older young people use the internet to connect to new people and friends more than young people do. That becomes clearer in this graph, which outlines the main reasons for using social networking services amongst 12 to 17-year-olds. And if you look at the ones here, these ones in this area, the main reasons is to chat to friends from school, find out what my friends are doing, chat to friends I know but who don't go to my school, and that's really important for children in years 7 and 8, where they're still in touch with their primary school friends who might be at a different secondary school. Arranging events to catch up with friends and do other social things, and here to make new friends. Another study, and the reference is dropped off this, 95% of the reasons for using the internet is to communicate with friends. 74% is for entertainment, 63% to share photos and videos. And 40%, this one down here, is to express their ideas. So here we start to see digital technologies are not being used just to communicate, but as a form of expression, a form of identity work that young people engage in. This one fascinating. So 97% of the young people in this study use Facebook daily, 61% use YouTube on a daily basis, 27% use Twitter, and 21%, so a fifth, view or write blogs on a daily basis. I think that's an enormously important idea for us to understand how our students, those young people in our classrooms, are engaging with social media and how frequently. These ideas are taken largely from the reading of Dana Boyd that you were asked to engage with this week, and the rest of her book. It's a really interesting read. If you get access and time, I'd go back and go deeper into that one. I found it a really fascinating source of ideas and information. So social media is a public space where you can hang out with friends, find new friends, and talk with them about matters that have always attracted teenagers. So in Dana Boyd's view, her research is telling her that teenagers in particular have always done this stuff. They always like to hang out. Shopping malls, shopping centres, places where they can go each other's houses. But that assumes that they have access to those spaces. When they don't have access to those spaces, social media provides a really easy alternative to access their network of friends and to find out about other friends. But they don't want to do it in front of their parents or other authoritative figures. Social media happens to be the ideal platform for all these gatherings that are essential for human development. Social media, according to Boyd, helps young people develop a sense of independence from parents and other adults. There are some myths about young people and social media. Adults may think that a computer or a smartphone makes a teenager socially isolated, but the reality usually is that the teen is using that device to overcome the social isolation imposed by adults. Social media often becomes a mode of communication for teens with their friends, which they can't do otherwise because of poor reach. Boyd talks about various publics, spaces that young people inhabit, and the importance for them of being in public. So if they can't be in public in the shopping centre to hang out with friends, they're in the public that social media affords them. But she goes further with her arguments that it's not just being in public, but it's being public, creating a public presence. And this is around more identity work. And it's about establishing yourself. And in the lecture we talked about the YouTube phenomenon, and I used the example of my stepson, who for the last 2 years has, on his own YouTube channel, uploaded a video review of every film that he's seen. And he has a number of followers. I used another example of a friend of my daughter's who has the most gorgeous pussycat called Gremlin Squishface. If you want to follow him on Instagram, go nuts. She has, I think, 10,000 followers. She's starting to get offers of sponsorship from pet food companies and pet accessory companies. And Squishy's pretty gorgeous, so she's enjoying that. We also talked about the YouTube personality or celebrity phenomenon, where young people for a particular talent, it might be something like skateboarding or hip-hop dancing, or it could be because of particular views that they hold, gain celebrity status. They make paid appearances at music festivals, on Jay Leno chat shows and the like, simply because of the number of followers that they have. And they can run a livelihood, earning money or things, so clothing, footwear, accessories, coke, and through this is an income generation stream from them. But it's also about identity work. It's also about young people developing a sense of self in a public environment. In the lecture, I did something quite brave, and I shared my Facebook profile page with the class. I'm not going to do it in this venue. That would be even riskier. But I asked the question, what does this tell you about me? What sort of picture of me does this construct in your view? I think people were quite astute at picking that I didn't have any qualms about sharing my political views via Facebook, that I was oriented towards environmental issues, and a few other things. And we then talked about how Facebook may, and other social media sites, may allow you to convey only a part of your identity. It's not necessarily your entire identity. And I used the illustration of my son when he was living in Canada. He's not a massive Facebook poster, as in he doesn't post very frequently to Facebook, but his friends, when he was in Canada, tagged him a lot in photos. The only problem was that most of the photos they tagged him in were at quite boozy parties and barbecues and whatever else. And he was concerned that as his Facebook friend, I was seeing only a particular aspect of his life when he was living away from me. And he went to great lengths to try and explain the other aspects of who he was being when he was living overseas. So it's relatively easy to portray parts of your life in social media, and as discerning adults, we tend to make more strategic choices about the identity that we portray. But the question is, do young people? And Boyd would argue that they have very little filtering about what they post on Facebook. And I'm sure we all have at least one Facebook friend whose tumultuous relationships are played out in a very public arena. So that's another issue to think about in terms of the students that you teach. Digital technologies are nearly everywhere, and as well as having a fairly significant impact on how young people communicate and develop a sense of self, digital technologies also have an impact on our notion of where education can take place, and importantly on the role that teachers might play within these spaces. In Greg Whitby's chapter this week, you read about a number of ideas he put forward regarding changes that might be required for today's digital learners, such as more student voice in what is learnt and how it's taught, more collaboration, more differentiation and personalisation, more creation, and so on. But his ideas were still within the frame of schools as we know them to be. But is there an alternative? Is there a more radical paradigm shift being brought about by technology? Do we need schools? Are they relevant? Can we do without them now? Are they an outmoded technology from an industrial age that should be dismantled? What happens if we reimagine schools altogether? The rhetoric around technology portrays technology as imbued with the ability to support fundamentally new ways of doing things. Think about robotic surgery, for example. Who would have thought? Growing numbers of educational technologists are beginning to see schools as they currently exist as irrelevant to and incompatible with the needs and demands of the digital age. It's a fairly big statement, and a couple of quotes up there reinforce this. Old gathering places no longer attract us. We can do many things without going anywhere. Technology provides a way for young people, and not so young people, to circumvent the traditional structures of their schools, to find things that schools aren't providing them, to move away from a set of structures that provide special activities that take place in special places at special times. So where young people are instructed in subjects for reasons that they little understand. And that's a quote from Ledbetter in 2008. And I guess what they're talking about there is that schools are a special place, quite different from the rest of the world, structured in quite different ways, through timetables and bells that ring, through the age levels that we aggregate our students into, through the compartmentalising of knowledge into subjects and disciplines that have little or no connections between them. Young people today are questioning that. They see through their use of digital technology quite a different world. They see and participate in an adult world, and yet they have this special place called school that's different from anything else in the rest of the world. Use of technology away from school allows young people far greater autonomy and freedom in what they learn, how they learn, and from and with whom they learn. And we know that young people are capable of doing this, given their engagement with digital technologies and social media. We've seen from the data that I showed you earlier how engaged young people are in this media. So alternatives do exist today that fall outside the formal traditional notion of a school. There's an example called the Not School, developed by Stephen Heppel over 12 years ago, an online space for disengaged young people for whom traditional school structures did not work. Gary Steger ran a similar sort of program in Maine in the United States for juvenile delinquents, I think was the term that was used back in those days. The Khan Academy is another example of how traditional schools can be circumvented. Online self-paced modules in a range of topics that young people and not so young people are accessing outside the structures of what we know as schools. This links back to some points that I raised in our very first lecture that I wanted to get you thinking about how we do education, where learning takes place, and it's not always in a school. I think some of the students in the face-to-face class thought that I was possibly pushing this barrow a little hard and that I was advocating for not schools. That's not exactly the case. You have to keep in mind that one of my tasks as your course coordinator and your teacher in this course is to get you to think quite deliberately about the views that you hold and why you hold them. By posing provocations such as this and in the next slide, I'm really getting you to examine those things that you assume to be and assume to be in concrete. Some of you had quite visceral reactions to the idea that we could do away with schools altogether. And quite frankly, I don't think that society is ready for that. I think the way society is structured has a lot to do with how schools have developed over the centuries. I know that I would not have had a career had there not been schools. For me, school was a place that my children were being cared for whilst they learn, and I outsourced that teaching to a school. So from a personal perspective, I think schools can be quite handy places. There's a whole other set of reasons why schools are important places as well, but you have to be able to articulate them and not necessarily hang on to long assumed conventions, but to question them and constantly question whether there is a different way. So a little more about the de-schooling movement, as it's called. And these ideas come from Doug Thomas and John Seely Brown in this little booklet, which is a really fascinating little read. And they refer to it, borrowing from Ito, about hanging out, messing about, and geeking out. And this is the way that we can learn in an online world, a socially connected world. And these ideas are underpinned by a couple of theories around learning that have emerged in recent times. So these include theories of Seymour Papert around constructionism, about the importance of tinkering, exploring, and extending our understanding. So to experiment, because it's through getting things wrong that we learn, as Papert would argue. A sense of play, of not being afraid to be active. And Brown and Thomas argue that this applies as much in a virtual world as it does in a real world. So it's not just tinkering with things made out of atoms, but with things that could be made of bytes. It could be things that are made of ideas, but tinkering and exploring, pursuing personal self-interest in self-directed ways. So that was this point here. Let's just jump back up to this point here. Hanging out. We've talked already excessively in this workshop about the way that technology mediates young people's sense of hanging out, finding out who they are in a social sense. But it also allows for this geeking out, this deep exploration, learning within a rich social context of peer interaction, participating in communities, I like these words, that traffic in esoteric domains of knowledge and practice. So apparently that's what Thomas and Brown think a geek might be. People who belong to communities in little esoteric domains of knowledge and practice. But these don't have to be about technology. You can learn so much online by dipping into in and out of communities. And it's not just about reading the text that somebody puts up. It's not about being a passive recipient of information that's channeled to you on the internet. It's about being an active participant in a learning community that happens to be mediated by technology, rather than a learning community that is mediated in a physical space, such as our classes here at university or a class at school. So these are really important ideas to think about. If this is the world that is possible, what are schools doing to harness the potential of that world and to connect with that world that our young people are immersed in on a daily basis? Other commentators argue that deschooling is a step too far. But nonetheless, a substantial reconstruction, a radical rethinking of the practices and processes and structures of schools to accommodate digital technologies appropriately is still needed. Talking about a transformation in how we do school rather than getting rid of school altogether. Greg Whitby, from one of your readings, would most likely fall into this category. And he and others like him argue that we need to change our curriculum and our pedagogy, and I would argue that we need to add to that our assessment practices. Along the lines of these points, these dot points on this particular slide, that we reflect more the needs and interests of our young people, that we differentiate and personalise and have self-paced learning and learning pathways that the learner themselves has more control over and can direct in ways that they don't currently. Our pedagogy needs to have learning that is participatory rather than passive, so moving away from information transmission to far more active learning, collaborative, not individual, and authentic inquiry and problem-based learning is characteristic of the sorts of structures and processes and practices that digital technology commentators talk about. What I find very interesting is that these sorts of practices are not dependent upon technology. You can have this with or without technology, but it's these sorts of practices where technology fits best. And it's these sorts of teaching and learning practices where young people seem to thrive most. For those who are interested, there was a podcast there's a podcast of an interview on ABC Radio National from the 27th of March, or the 28th of March, that the principal of Templestowe College was talking about the changes that he is making in his school that are along these lines. So we can see that transformation in action. One of the other elements to reschooling that we haven't talked about very much is the physical spaces of schooling. We talked about how learning can occur in virtual spaces, but schools are physical places. The built environment shapes our pedagogy, and having a more flexible physical environment can support more flexible pedagogical approaches that we take as teachers in our learning spaces. I have observed teachers trying to do different things, but are hamstrung because the sorts of learning activities they want to run won't work in the small relocatable classroom down the back of the school campus where they have been timetabled. There's only enough space in there for the 25 students to sit in rows. So our physical spaces probably need rethinking and transforming to accommodate for the much more personalised, self-directed, digital technology enriched type of learning that our young people are moving towards. I've given a couple of examples over here of some transformational things in schools that are happening. Templestowe College is one. Dandenong High School is another, if you wanted to go onto their website and have a look at their schools within schools model and the sorts of learning spaces they have designed to support a changed curriculum and pedagogy focus that is enriched through digital technologies. But the two things I wanted to talk to you very briefly about were, one, the maker movement. If you Google Gary Stager and the maker movement in education, you'll come across some examples of the direction that digital technology commentators are pushing for, where there is much more choice about what is learnt and how it's learnt, and much more involvement, active involvement in the making of things. So I've given you a link to a teaching blog that describes Gary Steger's work, written by Gary Steger and one of his colleagues. Another recent example from the press is the coverage of Finland, yet again leading the way in educational reform, who have decided to do away with discipline subjects, discipline-based subjects, and are moving towards a far more integrated curriculum. So I'd urge you to have a look in your own time at these examples of how some schooling systems are beginning to reschool. And in individual schools, you will see some elements of these sorts of changes occurring. And I wanted you to think about the ramifications in all of this, about what the role of the teacher becomes and how consistent or divergent this approach is to your notions of what a teacher does, of what you as a teacher want to be able to do, and to think about how this might fit with your philosophies about learning and teaching. I talked very briefly in the workshop about placement component, your 5 single days, and I wanted to allay some concerns that I've had a couple of students email me about. Yes, this is primarily an observational placement. There will also be, however, an expectation that you get down and dirty with the kids. I do not want you standing at the back of every lesson that you observe with your clipboard and stopwatch like a time and motion expert from the 1960s. That's not the goal. The goal is to try and build a second set of eyes. One that focuses on what you're doing with the students, the other one focusing on what else might be going on in the classroom. There will be some times when you will need to be the clipboard expert, but please don't use a clipboard, where you will choose to do a straight observation, and that's fine. But if that's all you do, that's not so fine. So where there is some group work, develop a rapport with the children, look at what they're doing, try and understand how they're learning, what level they're learning at. Be guided by your teacher mentor, but we wouldn't be expecting you to be delivering lessons to whole classes on this particular placement. We do want you to unpack what you are seeing in the classroom and be focused on quite specific and narrow areas every day that you're there. I'll talk more extensively about placement and expectations in next week's workshop, so please come, because there won't be a podcast next week.